Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar about virtual versus physical rethinking station design in shared mobility. My name is Mathilde, and I am very glad to be here today with you to discuss this topic. And in order to do so, I am joined by three micromobility experts: Marion Galán-Alfonso from Donkey Republic, Philippe Hebert from Nextbike, and Patrick Utz from Como UK. So, first of all, some information about how this webinar will proceed. Just know that a summary and slides will be shared at the end of the webinar, along with the recording of this webinar. During the roundtable session, feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A section. I will give you details about how to access this Q&A section in a few seconds. Just know that all questions will be answered at the end of the discussion. And don't worry if we don't have time to answer them all. We will send all the insights from the panelists along with the summary and the slides of this webinar. And last but not least, just know that the webinar will last 1 hour and will finish on time. Now, how to access this Q&A section? You can go on the right bottom corner of your screen, select the points that we have highlighted on the first step, then select Q&A section, and finally ask your question. Now, a few words of introduction about Qucit. Qucit is a French company developing a logistic optimization software for shared micromobility systems, and our mission is operational intelligence for and sustainable micromobility. We are already present in 14 countries in more than 30 cities across 3 different continents. We collaborate with public actors, meaning cities operating their shared micromobility systems themselves, such as Emel in Lisbon in Portugal. And we also work with private actors, meaning operators operating the shared micromobility system on behalf of the city, such as Bicycle Transit System in Philadelphia in the US. Now, a few words of introduction about our speakers. So I'm very glad to be joined today by Marion Galán-Alfonso, Head of Public Affairs at Donkey Republic, where since 2018 she has led collaborations with cities and regions across Europe to develop affordable, flexible bike sharing systems. She's passionate about reducing car dependency, and she champions cycling as a key to healthier, more sustainable urban mobility. Hi, Marion, and welcome to this webinar.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
I am also joined by Philippe Hebert, who has extensive experience in data analysis management and who is currently serving multiple roles at Nextbike since March 2020, including bid management, lead data analyst, and location planning. Thank you, Philippe, for joining us today, and very welcome.
Hello, everyone.
And finally, I am also joined by Patrick Utz, who is head of consultancy and research at Como UK, and who explores how shared transport enables people to move between places without having to own a vehicle, and what policymakers and businesses can do to support mobility that goes beyond private car use and ownership. Hi, Patrick, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
And now, before we dive deep into the details of this insightful conversation, a few words of introduction about how to set the stage. So let's go back in time a bit to 1965. That year, in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, white bikes were recycled bicycles that had been repainted and placed on the streets for anyone to use. It was a completely free-floating system, and the bikes were either kept or discarded. Then, in 1995, in Copenhagen, in Denmark, the caddy system was the very first incentive to return and share bikes. A few years later, in 1998, in Rennes, in France, Clear Channel integrated the very first computerized bike share system into its offering, requiring users to identify themselves and return the bike. Then it was in 2007 that a global trend took hold with the Veli bike sharing system of Paris. In 2014, it was Madrid that launched its dog-based e-bike share system. A couple of years ago, in Italy, The number of e-bikes increased significantly by 18% between 2023 and 2024, with 70% of these bikes part of a free-floating system. Meanwhile, within station-based system, mechanical bikes accounted for 17% of total compared to 4% of e-bikes. But what about now? So thanks to a very recent study on return on investment in bike sharing schemes released by the former CIE last October, we know that nowadays in Europe, around 150 European cities across 30 countries operate bike sharing schemes, with a fleet of more than 430,000 bicycles. Within that number, 61% of them are dog-based, 39% are dockless, and 79% are mechanical bikes, while 21% are e-bikes. And finally, 60% of them belong to a private bike share scheme, while 40% of them are part of a public one. One thing is for sure. Mobility is changing over time. With the emergence of the first bike sharing systems, followed by today's e-bikes, stations are also evolving. One thing remains, our goal, to make micromobility accessible to as many people as possible. And it is with that in mind that we welcome our three panelists of today. So to get started, maybe our operators, Nextbike and Donkey Republic, could give a brief introduction about the way they work, the shared micromobility system they work with, by maybe sharing one concrete example. Marion, Philippe, if you want to take the lead.
Yes. Hi, so I'm Marion. I work for Donkey Republic. It's a Danish bike sharing company, but we operate in quite a few countries in Europe. We are mainly using virtual stations, and I know we will get into those questions afterwards, and very few dog-based stations. And maybe one example we can use is the example of the region of Antwerp. So around the city of Antwerp in Belgium and its regional area, where we have virtual stations also linked to public transport hubs, especially in the more peri-urban and rural areas. And that's probably one of the questions I will come back after, is which type of station for which type of geography. And we operate both pedal bikes and electric bikes, as we could see on the previous slide from the return on investment study. And we also have public schemes and some private schemes. So we are in both categories. And then maybe Philippe, if you want to take over.
Yes, sure. Yeah, we at Nextbike, we design, develop, and operate bike sharing schemes all over Europe. We are in around 300 cities. And from the technology we use or we develop and implement is on the one side, the station-based with docks, so physical infrastructure. And on the other side, also virtual stations with a geofenced area. And of course, what is a main thing is the hybrid, the combination of both technologies for certain areas, regions, and cities. Depends on the use case, what is needed. And in terms of bikes, we have the mechanical bikes, the classic ones, and also electrical bikes with swappable batteries. And also in some cases, cargo bikes and e-cargo bikes. Maybe one good example is the area of Cologne here, which is a very, very big city scheme where we have that combination of a hybrid system in the city center. There are mainly virtual hubs, virtual stations. And then when you go out into the rural areas, or not rural areas, more in the regional extent, there are a lot of physical charging stations implemented where the customers can rent the bike at these stations and the bikes are directly charged on the ground. That back to you, Mathilde.
Yes, thank you. And now maybe, Patrick, you could introduce the work that you do at Como UK and how it is related to bike share schemes and station design.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So Como UK is the UK-wide charity or non-profit organization for the environmental, social, and economic benefit of shared transport. So that covers bike share, but it also extends into car sharing, shared e-scooters, and the integration of those modes with public transport. So we are partially funded through grants that are mainly given out by public authorities in the UK, but also through consultancy that we do directly with public authorities. We are neutral towards operators, so we don't do any commissioned work for operators, but we have an accreditation scheme and a membership scheme for car club operators or car sharing operators, but also for shared micromobility operators like Nextbike or Donkey Republic. To be from a UK member, the operators have to adhere to certain quality standards, which then makes it also easier for the local authorities when they procure the services from an operator, because they can basically reference our quality standards without having to reinvent the wheel and make up their own quality standards from scratch.
Thank you. And now I would like to ask you all, what do you think is it to take into account when choosing a station type? Is it topography? Is it weather conditions or budget? Yes, go ahead.
I start. So maybe in general, it's like from the perspective I take personally, from a planning perspective, also with my urban planning background, is on the one side the city landscape, and on the other side, the user side, so from the end customers. And what needs to be said is that every city and every region has its own qualities and characteristics in terms of topography. This is one key player, definitely, to decide on the technology. If you first, which mode of transport, or mode of vehicle, e-bikes or not e-bikes, mechanical bikes, which then leads also to the answer, or gives a hint on which station infrastructure makes more sense. But of course, like more detailed analysis on the demographics and social surroundings in the city, in the different districts, must be taken into account, and the commuting flows, especially like from the center, for example, to an industrial area. What are the flows there? What is what are the ways? Where are the stations? And then comparison. So as the next key factor, where is existing there already in terms of public transport of the network, and to find areas or spots. Where can we align and complement to the existing network and give this value added to the city and the citizens at the end. Maybe it's worth it to make a little example on that. Let's take a mid-sized city which has around 200 to 400,000 inhabitants. From the topography, it's like a hilly. There's a touristic area on the hill, and then you have a city center which is quite flat. And now the question is, which infrastructure do I want to choose, and which bike types do I want to choose? On the first question. And then the other side is the city wants to have public ordered space, for example. City wants to provide more possibilities to commute between the city center and the industrial areas, which means, maybe you have a little bit more longer trips, which gives an, you need maybe e-bikes. Then you have touristic trips in that city. And of course, you want to have somehow also to save space somehow in the city. And then it's the question, taking that into consideration, hilly, you have commuting ways, then city center with high traffic volumes, and at the end you want to integrate it into the existing public transport network. There's the question, maybe it makes sense to have charging stations on the one side to support the e-bikes, especially on the hilly side, so that you can go up the hill as a tourist, for example, and have a charging station or a returning point where you can return the bike, and you always know, you have a charged e-bike there. And then on the other side, you have the city center, which is quite dense, which makes sense to have also a hybrid or maybe a mixed solution on certain hotspots on public transport areas where you have a high demand to place also like physical stations. It's visible directly. You have always availability of bikes, e-bikes and normal bikes. And then besides that, you have in that more like living areas and districts, not that much space, and then it makes sense to combine it with that virtual stations, so that the user has or the citizens have direct access to the bike and can drive very convenient to their housings or also to their working places. And then, as I said, the aim is also to cover these industrial areas, which is maybe often more on the borders of a city, where then also makes sense. Okay, on certain places, let's place some stations also with charging infrastructure, and then you have all these different aspects and characteristics of that city, which leads to, okay, here in that sense, I would suggest in a planning perspective, it's a hybrid system. So you have on the one side a charging station at some spots, and on the other side, on some spots, the virtual station, which gives a hybrid combination and accessible, available system network in total.
Thank you, Philippe, for your insights. Maybe Marion or Patrick, you have a different point of view.
Yes, well, not completely different. I agree that the fact of the topography needs to be taken into account, and the different flows of commuters as well, and the UX. I just wanted to maybe look also on the public side about it, more exactly the public budget, because when we think about bike sharing system, and I think I wanted to say that when we're talking about charging stations, we are talking about a publicly funded system, because you need to have investment costs that the costs are going to be quite high when you are starting a system with charging stations. That means it's usually after a public procurement, which is the case for most of the systems you have in Europe with stations, dock-based or charging. And in that sense, that means that the tender needs to be, if a city wants the system that Philippe is mentioning, which is a great system, a hybrid system with charging stations and then virtual stations where you have a high density and the lack of, well, usable public space, you will need to have a budget that follows this wish. But also you will need to have a timeline for the setup of the station and also for the length of the contract of the public bike share system that is long enough for it to make sense, because it's a very high investment from the side of the city, because it's a lot of construction work, permits, and also from the side of the operator and provider. So that means that for any contract below a certain number of years, charging station would not make sense, either financially, but also because of the way you'll still be in the construction or implementation side at the end of the contract. And we're seeing more and more cities in Europe where budgets are constrained. And that's why a hybrid system, like Philippe was mentioning, is quite a good one, where you have less pressure on the budget compared to a fully charging station network, or fully virtual for cities where it would make sense. And in many northern cities in Northern Europe, you would have a system that makes sense without charging stations. And you can also run regional systems on virtual stations as well.
Yes, that's right. Patrick, would you have any additional ideas to adapt to that question?
Yeah, sure. Just 2 quick points, I suppose. The main things have been covered already. When we're talking about hybrid systems, maybe one thing to also add to the mix is also the option of having free-floating options. So I suppose that would then go beyond if you have either virtual or physical infrastructure where the bike must be returned, but also a larger area where you can return the bikes. And I guess what we have been seeing in the UK recently is basically a move towards having some kind of designated parking areas in the city center, so that users know what the rules are and that you constrain the spread of street cluster of vehicles being left on pavements, etc. And then when you go out into the less densely populated areas, you would probably have a free floating system in residential areas to help people commute for their first and last mile. So I suppose, yeah, the main point, as I said, would be mainly extending that scope a little bit and also thinking beyond the parking infrastructure and adding the free floating component into the mix as well.
Yes. And do you think there is a specific type of bikes according to the station type in place?
Not necessarily, but I think what we have been seeing, and you had that on the slides about the Italian bike share schemes, is that overall there is a strong trend towards e-bikes. And I think that has a key factor there is that people are willing to pay more for e-bikes, and that the return on investment is generally higher for e-bikes than for pedal bikes.
Yes. Mario, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I think it again depends on what you're meaning, but yes, depending on the type of stations you want as a city, for example, or region, it will influence the characteristics of the bike. So yes, it can be electric bikes or pedal bikes. For electric bikes, of course, then if you want to have a hybrid system, the power of the battery and how much it needs to be swapped, how often it needs to be swapped will be very important. So there are some characteristics to look at once you have decided on which stations or which system you would like for your city. And that will impact the type of bikes as well. Not directly the e-bike versus pedal bike or cargo bike, but more the characteristics of each vehicle you need to
invest. Yes, Philippe?
Yeah, I also want to add on that development in the bike share market. What I see at least is that the fleets get more electrified. You get more e-bikes into the cities, which makes sense definitely. And additionally, it's also like the thing that a lot of cities have experienced now in bike sharing schemes. So it's not like, okay, the first bike sharing schemes are there. So there are multiple cities, European-wide, also worldwide, which also already had and have 10 years, for example, bike sharing experience, which is quite good, which is important to mention. And based on that experience, it comes to that electrification of fleets and also to add maybe a former mechanical fleet more into an e-bike fleet. And which means then also, okay, how can I provide or give that that coverage of stations and e-bike network in the whole city? So it's not like you have it in the city center, it's going out into the in the outskirts, surrounding areas to connect really also the regions in the cities, which is also a tendency. And for that you have longer trips, or longer trips are made. At least that's a tendency, and which also is an argument for more e-bikes. And then to operate these systems, you definitely also need to think about, okay, how can I electrify or how can I operate an electrified fleet in terms that the bikes are already or always charged and the end customer has always the possibility to ride the bike and use the bike when he or she needs it. And there it comes again to that question, the bike type, e-bike fleet with, I would say definitely always with a changeable battery, so that you have the possibility in case there's no charging somewhere on the ground, you can swap it. But on the other side, to reduce operational efforts, especially in big region, in big cities and highly used cities, which is also a trend that the e-bike schemes are very highly used, which is also the aim of cities and us as operators, and in general to bring more sustainable mobility into the cities in terms of bikes. It makes sense to think about, okay, hey, maybe on some spots where we have high usage to place a charging station, so we don't need to drive there and change the battery. In certain cases, to lower the operational efforts in certain areas, not in all cases, but in certain areas and for certain user rates. And it's also like, in general, it is coming back to that, it's depending on the city and the extent of a system in total. And of course, it's more investment, that's true, definitely. But if you want to keep it for the next 10 years, it makes sense to invest and to take money into your hand and say, okay, We want to have a long lifespan of our fleet and our operation in itself, and also the station infrastructure with a high value, long livable, then makes sense to invest in such a system.
Yeah. Do you think maybe the culture influenced the type of system to be implemented? Maybe, Patrick, if you could give an example about the UK.
Yeah, sure. I mean, generally, perhaps within the UK, we don't see too much of a difference. There are obviously cities that are performing better than others in terms of the infrastructure and the level of cycling. But I guess overall, the UK bicycle market, and that relates to shared bikes, but also to individually owned bikes, is lagging behind most other Western European countries. And I think that has maybe a little bit to do with the fact that what Marion mentioned earlier about public budgets being quite tight and having been quite tight for probably a few years more than in other parts of Western Europe. And I think now when we're looking at the economic situation in Germany and neighboring countries, I think that this is probably, unfortunately, a situation that other cities will have to look into as well. So those investments, when they are possible, they are a great thing to do for a city. But I think that there will have to be more creative ways of how bike share can be made workable and doable on lower public budgets. And I think it is ultimately a trade-off of how you can sort of what the best thing is, what for the users and what the users expect and what the public sector can provide in terms of funding. But that wasn't really an answer to your question, and unfortunately, I'm sorry about that. But I think that the monetary side of things probably has a bigger impact on the bike share schemes that we're seeing on the ground than the cultural one. But obviously, in a place like the Netherlands, you have a different cycle culture, and that will have its impact. But that goes without saying.
Yes, don't worry. You nicely introduced our next question. So moving on to the cost and the investment sides, how do you explain the investment dedicated in dedicated physical stations, charging docks, for example, versus the flexibility and lower cost of virtual stations? If or Philippe want to take the lead on that one.
Sure, yes. I mean, costs in terms of real money is on the one side, but you also have costs and efforts on the other side, and it depends again on the aim of the city. And yeah, I would say if you invest something and you want to have an outcome or a backcome or a break even sometime or a return on invest on this, and to justify this one is at the end to look at the whole period of a contract. So of course you have an investment in the beginning, and a system needs to be established, needs to be advertised so that the customers come, that they get used to it, that they will use it. This costs all money in the beginning. It's not only the infrastructure what you put there in, but also the investments in terms of marketing and etc. and all that stuff to make it really a visible system. And it brings to the next point, the infrastructure, like physical infrastructure, is a visible element of city infrastructure and in the urban landscape. So everyone can see it. It's there when you, for example, look at Paris. So these stations are there for a long time. So they are part of the city, of the whole city environment, of the landscape. And they are seen as an essential part of public transport. And in comparison to if you establish, I would say easily said, just geofenced areas, it's not that visible. You just have these colored bikes which are used or can be used, but it's for citizens who are not really into that whole topic of micromobility, and then as a different additional mode to public transport, tram and bus, not really visible sometimes. And these charging stations or physical stations, they really show you, hey, you can use me, I'm here, I'm always available, and I work as a bike. And at the end, then coming back to the contract duration to justify it, what we see in certain cases, not everywhere, and it definitely needs more experience and more data behind it. But there is a point after certain years that the initial investment of a system with physical infrastructure has a break even at a certain point, where the usage goes higher and higher, which means you need more operational efforts, especially in e-bike systems. On the other side, you get more revenues from the end customers because they ride more, they bring more utilization rates, so rides per bike per day, which then brings the return on invest of such a system, and also justifies an investment long term.
Yes, go ahead, Marion.
Yes, I agree with Philippe, but I would like to nuance some points, because we're talking a lot about e-bikes, which I think is really important. So what we're saying here is mainly about charging stations. You can also have a lot of systems without e-bikes or with e-bikes and pedal bikes, where then for pedal bikes, the culture, as you mentioned right before, will influence how you set up the virtual stations. So in a lot of countries, they will be set up only on bike racks, where the bike has to be chained, so you can maintain the order, but yet have less investment, and investment from the city then can last way after the contract length with one or several providers. And also in a lot of those systems, even public bike share system with virtual stations, you have then a very easy investment and cheap investment, which is to use those bike racks, or in Northern Europe, those parking spots that are made with the paint on the ground, with signage, so with totems, with signs to, just like Philippe said, show that it's part of the public transport network, to show that it is connected, that you have information also at the stations for the main stations. So then you have the flexibility of the virtual stations, where you can have stations every 200 meters in a dense area with very limited number of spots. So you are not invading the public space, as we can have seen quite recently with e-scooters, for example, or certain issues in cities, where it's really dedicated space, and yet it's in harmony with the current public space and the public transport network. So for pedal bikes, it's actually really easy to incorporate into the public space. And for e-bikes, you can do the same and have, as mentioned, some hotspots of charging stations where it makes a lot of sense. And then smaller hubs, smaller stations where you will have less usage in those areas.
Yes, so that comprehensive comparison of pros and cons and cost clearly illustrates the different economics models of shared micromobility. I would now like to address the day-to-day challenges. What is the biggest challenge in terms of daily operations, depending on the kind of station in place? Marion, Philippe, if you want to.
I can start, and then you can take away. So on day-to-day, again, we have not touched upon docking stations. Docking stations are the same as charging stations for either pedal bikes or for pedal bikes and e-bikes, but without charging, which is not that common. So for docking station and bikes and charging station, the issue is that the system is not flexible. So you cannot return the bike. So then you have issues with the UX. The users can sometimes not return the bike where they want to go, especially for the big commuters flow in the morning and in the evening, where people start or end in similar stations. So that creates tension on the rebalancing process, and rebalancing is extremely costly. So that creates that usually if you have a public contract, you'll have KPIs for those stations, and that will create actually a lot of movement that are also emitting CO2. So sometimes then you are basically not offsetting the CO2 you are gaining with the bike share system because of heavy rebalancing in systems that are really tense, such as Paris, Madrid, and so on. However, in terms of operation, then for charging stations or for bikes, e-bikes, you will then have the advantage of not having to swap the batteries and having bikes that are charging directly And depending how your virtual station system is set up, it can look more orderly. Again, that depends how it is set up within the territory. And then the pros for virtual stations, you can have many virtual stations of very small capacities, for example, to create a dense network, and then big stations or charging stations at the main points, such as train stations, city center, and so on. So that would be the case and the con is that you would have to swap a bit more. So that's why I was saying that the characteristic of the electric bike is very important for a city when tendering or region when tendering, because that will impact a lot the times a bike needs to be swapped. And that means the operation will be more costly or not, depending also on the type of battery and e-bike that is provided by the operator.
Yes. Maybe Philippe, one other idea on that topic?
Mainly agree on a lot of topics, but also want to emphasize that here is really depending on the characteristics of a system. So it's really an individual thing, at the end you can call it like that maybe. But also having that said, to have the pros and cons maybe quickly again for virtual stations, clearly it is a very good thing to establish very fast a dense network in a city, which is quite good, definitely. And you can establish pedal bikes, SBOBs and cargo bikes, everything there, of course. And for the end customers, or maybe to stay in the operational view, on the other side, what that means is also you need to operate more. You need to have more these rebalancing efforts, because more stations brings more possibilities for the end customers to return the bike somewhere. So there is a higher or a different dynamic in the system. So these 2 points, one pro, one con, and then for the physical stations, there's one point which wasn't mentioned. Doesn't matter if it's charging or not charging, is vandalism and theft topic. That these charging stations definitely have that positive effect of, we saw that in a lot of cases, that the vandalism rate goes down, or at least the stolen bikes goes down, because they are safe at a safe spot. And additionally, you can combine a physical station with a virtual station on top, with a geofenced area around it. So if all spots are full, you can place a bike besides that station and just return it in that geofence area. On the other side, it's right, it's more invest in the first place. But again, if you want to have other pros like visible, high value and long livable system, with main point is also orderly parked. You have always a row where the bikes are returned, which is very important for the city landscape in some cases, or a lot of cases, I would say. And again, I'm coming back always to that point that the combination of these elements is important to offer, or to give the possibility in that planning and ramping up of a system. And additionally, virtual stations, that's also needs to mention, are very good for events. For example, if you have like football event, a big one or something like that, or like Olympia or something in Paris, then it's good to have the possibility to very flexibly implement certain spots, locations where you have a high demand of mobility, to say, okay, now we have for a certain time here a station, and maybe it turns out that this station is used after that event, and it can be turned into a fixed station, or also maybe a physical station.
Yes, it can always evolve with time. So now a specific question for Patrick. In the UK, what are the policies that municipalities can implement in order to facilitate the access of shared micromobility systems to the greater number? And does it influence the type of station to be implemented?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question, and it's a very timely question as well, because there's a lot going on with local policies at the moment and local politics in the UK. So I think the first point is to say that there is no overall regional or national policy for these kinds of things that the municipalities are implementing. So there is no sort of bigger strategy. And that in some instances can be a real problem. And I think that becomes most obvious in a place like London, where there is no, I mean, there is the Greater London Authority, but basically London is a mix of 32 different municipalities. And that means there are different rules and different contracts in all the different parts of London, which means that you can maybe return a bike in one borough, but not in the neighboring one. And that creates quite a few problems for shared transport overall, and also for shared cars, which is why the biggest car sharing operator is also withdrawing by the end of the year from London. So that's my moan about what local authorities can and cannot do. But at the same time, there's also quite a bit of potential, but also uncertainty, because local government will be quite fundamentally reorganized, at least in England, in the coming years. And that will introduce a licensing scheme for shared micromobility, so mainly for bikes and e-bikes, which then allows the new local authorities that are likely to be bigger than the existing ones to have certain quality standards in place. That there is an expectation that will make the management of shared micromobility somewhat more effective and streamlined, and to spread out, to make this effective, to spread the use of shared micromobility and shared bikes to bigger numbers of users. Yeah, I think the fundamental thing is mainly an investment in safe cycling infrastructure, because there we see a big gap in the UK, but I suppose in many countries in Europe. And it needs to be safe to use bikes, whether individually owned or shared. And I think this is probably the main part of the homework that needs to be done before user groups or potential user groups who are not using shared bikes at the moment are considering to use them. And as I said, the e-bikes are probably somewhat helpful to lower the threshold to start using shared micromobility. But I think mainly it is about creating the safe infrastructure for those kinds of vehicles, which means by extension also taking away space from cars.
Yes, thank you. So now I would like to tackle a topic that was mentioned by Philippe earlier, and that remains quite taboo in the micromobility sectors. I would like to talk about vandalism. So according to the kind of station chosen, how do you face and prevent vandalism as an association, as a municipality, and as an operator? Yes, go ahead, Marion.
Yes, I think we've seen vandalism, I can say, for Donkey Republic quite differently depending on countries and cities. And I noticed there was also one question popping up about this, but for example, in quite a few cities, we have, it is mandatory to chain the bike on the rack of the virtual station. Which is not the case in Northern Europe, also because the culture is very different. So you do not have to do it for your own bike. So then you don't do it also for the bike sharing system. So in many countries where you do have quite a bit of vandalism, actually chaining the bike with a really proper chain provided by the bike sharing system to the rack is quite similar to a docking system with the flexibility on top. Of course, that doesn't prevent all vandalism, just like the docking stations, as you could see in Lausanne or in Paris or in other places as well. And in terms of theft, there are a lot of things that are currently, and for most of the providers, I know it's the case as well, integrated directly on the bike with alarms, for example, and things like that, to make sure that it is harder to steal. Yeah, so maybe Philippe, if you want, or Patrick, if you want to also.
Yes, go ahead, Philippe. And then we will have one final questions before opening the floor for questions from the audience.
Yeah, just want to agree with you, Mario. I just want to add some points. Like one side is the technology, which is developing and evolving, like certain sensors or possibilities to integrate in these bikes to recognize immediately, okay, there's something happening which is not really a normal way how it should be. And then of course these alarmings, And one aspect is also the user communication from the beginning, to create somehow awareness that all the people who walk around or see bikes, okay, let's see these as a public or a common good somehow. It's maybe a little bit too far, but in that direction, so that everyone takes a little bit care, because it's made for the citizens. It's made for you at the end. It's there to be used and not to vandalize. And on the other side, you can't avoid it, because you have always somewhere some things which will pop up, which is not a problem of the technology itself or bike sharing itself. It's mostly just single people who start to create a wave or something, and then you need to tackle that very fast in good cooperation also with the local authorities, and for example also the policies and stuff like that. Just adding that, and of course the infrastructure itself again gives certain security on theft and vandalism.
Patrick, something to add maybe?
Yeah, just one quick point. I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think there's just one thing also in terms of how the digital side of the services are run. I think there's a bit of a tension between keeping the threshold for using shared bikes quite low, in the sense of ideally, I think it has been trialed in some places. You have just a tap on, tap off system where you use your credit card and that's it. But that then comes at the expense of operators and then potentially also the police and authorities knowing who is using the bikes. The opposite is what we have in England, where the system is quite restrictive for e-scooters and where you have a requirement for people to register their driving license. So then the police can quite easily track who has been renting out a bike last before it went missing. But of course, it comes at it raises the threshold for using these modes, and will also reduce the user base, because some people who might want to ride a bike or an e-scooter just don't have a driving license.
Thank you. So now, as the end of 2025 is approaching, I would like to ask and before opening up the floor for questions from the audience, if you had to choose one KPI to judge station strategy success in 2026, what would it be and why? Maybe Marion or Philippe.
Yeah, I can start. So I can start. Yeah, happy to do so. So for me, it would be access, reliability, and availability of bikes in general, because that combines different aspects of a system. So one side is the probability that a user can find a bike, which is very important, and can start a ride and use it. On the other side, it is also like it gives you hints. Maybe the station network is not dense enough if the availability or the access reliability is very low. So it means okay, you maybe need to say densify it and say not every 500 meters is a station, so every 200 or 300 meters needs to be a station. At the end, this metric balances the density, the availability in one KPI. So that would be my take on that. Of course, there's a lot of more KPIs, but if I would choose one, then this one.
Thank you. Marion, maybe?
It's very linked. We have dashboard shared with the clients, so the municipality or the region, where you can see all the time, it's a heat map, where when a user tried to find a bike and could not find one. And that helps us setting up more stations, because then you know exactly where the demand is, either rebalancing more, increasing the capacity, or setting up a new station, like Philippe mentioned, for example, maybe every 200, 300 meters because it was too far away. So that's, I think, one of the KPI. And the second one would be to take the goal of the municipality. So that's very individual. That could be that they want to increase the modal shift of biking and public transport, for example. And then you would have to run surveys during the year and make sure that users actually find a bike close to their home to go to the train station if it's a regional system. So basically setting up the KPI with the outcome that the municipality wants and finding a good way to measure the fact that you're going towards this result.
Thank you. So we will now open the floor for questions from the audience. I will take the first one, which is from Mark Strong. What do you think about incentives in hybrid system for riders to return cycles to hubs? For example, extra minutes or cheaper trips?
Should I take? I can take it with the
Yes,
first answer. Yeah, actually, this is a good idea to also support the availability and the usage in itself. Definitely needs to be thought about how it would look like in detail, because it also can lead to some misunderstandings that too much free rides are there, for example, and then it leads to a bad performance of the system at the end. But in general, it definitely helps and supports the whole dynamic of the system. So in a natural way. So you can, you can create a natural rebalancing and dynamic in a system by placing certain incentives for a return, for example, at a certain station or in a certain virtual station, doesn't matter at the end. Or for example, also during events, makes sense to implement incentives when you have a high demand somewhere at a football stadium again. Then you can say, hey, if you return the bike to the football stadium with your normal commuting route, then you get some free minutes on the next ride, for example.
I agree with Philippe in the sense that it is a really good tool, but you have to be very smart in how to implement it, because the city of New York, the bike sharing of New York did that, and we could see that it became almost a professional thing to basically get rewarded with a bit of money for those trips to rebalance the bikes, and then people were basically just riding the bike to rebalance it instead of people who would be able to use it to actually commute. So yes, definitely a good idea to have incentives, but then, as Philippe said, it needs to be probably just not put in place generally for city, but really case by case and in a very thorough manner.
Thank you, Marion and Philippe. We have questions from Stefano, who says that he used to be a deputy mayor for mobility in Bergamo, and that they introduced a flexible bike sharing systems, stations, limited free floating, and e-bikes on hilly routes, and that it was economically sustainable and appreciated. And he asks if you agree that station also signal public presence, especially in peripheral areas. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. Honestly, my little example when I was thinking about the mid-sized city was Bergamo. I wanted to ask if someone recognized that city, but yeah, at the end, definitely it shows that that presence of public transport, as I said at the beginning, it becomes part. The physical infrastructure becomes part of the public transport and the city furniture. And you can design it in a way that it looks like okay, from the public transport operating company or from the city, and then you see it directly. Okay, this is something official, something high valuable, and people recognize it like that, and which also allowing this visibility can also lead to lower risks of vandalism and theft.
Thank you. We have another question from Friedrich. Sorry about the pronunciation. Should locking bikes to the rack should be mandatory? If so, what happens when the first bike no longer fits in the rack?
Maybe I can take that one. So in some countries it is. So I can answer that. In some countries it is. In some countries, the regulation for permits allows some operators not to lock or chain the bike to the bike rack because it was set up for e-scooters originally, and then the e-scooters were banned, and then you had the e-bikes coming up. It's the same thing as a docking station, in the sense that if you don't have any more space, that means you need to also rework how you set up your stations and have maybe more stations around. And that can usually be, and that was another question, it's usually in coordination with the municipality or the regional authority, depending who has the land. And for example, in the canton of Geneva, We started with around 100 stations, and we ramp up to 600. So you can just add more stations, smaller ones, bigger ones, on bike racks, always making sure that you still either leaving space for private bikes or that it's dedicated bike racks. And usually it's the color of the system and the public transport and so on, and with signage and so on. And yes, you can always park your bike a few meters away, but that's not what we're encouraging, because the idea is to get the city organized and also to make sure that the bikes are not impeding people walking on sidewalks, strollers, people with reduced mobility, or people that would not be able to see the bike.
Thank you, Mario. Maybe, Patrick, you could take the lead on the next one, which is a question from Alessandro. What is the future of other forms factors in shared micromobility schemes, such as cargo bikes and mini mobility?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I suppose, and Philip and Marian, please contradict me if you don't agree. But I think for operators there is always an urge to find a sweet spot between making vehicles bespoke for particular users, but also to not make them too specialized so they preclude a big number of users. So with cargo bikes, I think the problem is that the user base, at least for now, is quite small, but at the same time, the costs are quite high. But we have in the UK run a couple of pilot projects and studies with disabled people, and the regulations for e-scooters in the UK are quite strict. But you could, for instance, and a lot of the feedback was, yeah, if there was a seat on an e-scooter, you could probably encourage a greater number of people also with a disability to use them, and to ideally then also to avoid some car trips. So I suppose there is some flexibility around vehicles, but they because of the nature of those vehicle sharing systems, I think they can never be too bespoke and too targeted to a particular group. So there needs to be a certain user base for those vehicles. But like a seat on an e-scooter will probably not scare many people off using them, but it will enable some additional people of using the e-scooter.
Thank you. So another question from Tom. What do you see as the best way for local authorities or equivalent to interact with operators on parking locations? Who should take the responsibility for creating new locations?
I think on that one, it would depend on the system, in the sense, if we're talking about permits or if you're talking about public bike share system, for example. So if we are talking about public bike share system, usually there's already an idea of the coverage you have to do as an operator. And then as an operator, you come with data, you ask for some places that would make sense because you can see demand, and then you discuss it as it's accepted or rejected. That's what I mentioned for Geneva, for example. If you're talking about permits, usually some cities are setting up dedicated zones for the bigger stations, or where the public space is the more tense, the user's public space. And then the operators can also come up with places where they can put their bikes or e-scooters. But that usually is not as easy when compared to when you're operating a public bike share system, for obvious reasons, I would say.
Thank you. Yes, Philippe, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's more like depends on which ground who owns the space at the end. In general, I think it's the city or the authority who should decide at the end, and also takes the responsibility in terms of making it a fast process in giving permits and stuff like that. And on the other side, the operators should give input where to expand and where to maybe create new locations. But what I want to emphasize is that the flexibility for an operator should be given, that the operator also can work with certain institutions, universities, or something like that to implement other use cases in that system on their own. Of course, it needs to be decided in that round of mobility or of the contract owners and the operators at the end. But yeah, giving the flexibility also to operators to decide and choose for corporations and implement locations and stations is important.
Thank you, Philippe. Patrick, you wanted to add something up before we conclude the session?
Yeah, I'm conscious of the time. Just one quick thing on the land ownership, and one thing that's been quite tricky, at least in the UK, is the land that's owned by public transport operators, such as railway operators. But those are the stations that, in our experience, work the best. And if we had more time, I would be curious to hear about your experience from other countries on this, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So this is what concludes our meetup of today. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you all had a good time. Huge thanks to the panelists of today for their insights. I hope you all enjoyed our webinar and stay tuned for more.